But welcome everyone to another Your Morning Coffee podcast special, a conversation with Russ Crupnick. Russ is a managing partner of MusicWatch, a research and analytics firm that has been the go-to source for understanding the music and entertainment industries for decades. In fact, MusicWatch was the first company to ever measure how we listen to audio. So Russ has truly seen it all.
In this conversation, Russ walks us through the key findings from MusicWatch's annual music study. He unpacks the biggest shifts happening in the industry right now and explores one of the most fascinating transitions in modern media, the move away from a transactional economy, where it's all about the share of wallet, to an attention economy, where the real currency is share of time. So now, without further ado, here's a conversation with Russ Crupnick. Let it roll.
Stand by for transmission.
This is London calling.
Wake up! The revolution is at hand!
Your morning coffee is on the air. 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 On the air.
Standing by.
Your morning coffee, the weekly music news for the new music business. It's the highly curated, agitated, advocated, moderated, and liberated digital music information that you need to know. We are your digital music authority. And now from our studios in Hollywood, California, here's your hosts, Jay Gilbert and Mike Etchart.
Russ, it's good to see you. Thanks for taking time out of your busy day today.
Great to be back, Jay. Thanks for having me back.
Oh, so much is going on. I want to kick this off about some general things. Like MusicWatch has been tracking music consumer behavior for a long time, decades. Is there a sort of a single shift in how people relate to music that you've observed over the years?
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously we date back to we started the business at the peak of the CD days. So we've had over the last 25 years or so, we've watched digital downloads come in. We watched the rise and fall of piracy, the early days of Pandora and Rhapsody and streaming and all,
Ringtones.
Yeah, all the way to AI and maybe we'll talk about music discovery later, but
Sure.
back when radio was king of discovery and you heard a song and made a right turn into Borders or Tower or wherever Walmart
I miss those
and
days.
got that
Yeah.
CD. So yeah, I mean, I think that's what's been fascinating for me because I've always been much more interested in kind of the business side of things than necessarily who's at the top of the charts. There are folks who do a great job of that, but I think the business and how it's evolved, and interestingly, how some things remain the same. We're talking about a lot about AI, and it triggers a lot of sort of the early digital file sharing kind
Yeah.
of argument. So in some sense, we just kind of go around in a circle here.
Yeah, we'll definitely get into that. There's so much optimism in the industry right now, record revenues, streaming growth, touring's doing well. What do you think? I mean, you look at the numbers closer than most people. Is that optimism warranted? Are there warning signs, that people maybe aren't paying attention to?
Yeah, I mean, I just one thing I want to go back to because it was something that
Sure.
struck me, when I was actually looking at a chart from 10 years ago, and you were kind enough, you posted it last week on the website about listening, and I thought, well, that's pretty, it's pretty benign at first look. If I were AI, I would just say, well, that's, not so much has changed, maybe a little with, short form video. And then it kind of struck me on second look, how much things actually have changed over the last 10 years with the advent of TikTok and other short form video.
Yeah.
That if you go back about a decade, we were really kind of oral and, kind of oral with an A. It was very much about the audio and the listening experience. And when I was looking at the kind of the patterns of how we're listening today, it's really become much more of a visual experience. You've got
Interesting.
YouTube, you've got TikTok, but now we're also, we're looking at live streams, we're looking at streaming documentaries. About one in three music fans have watched full-length concerts or docs on things like Netflix or Disney or Apple TV. So
Hmm.
I think that really kind of changes the game. Whereas, music is traditionally, like it or not, for a lot of us, it's background listening, right? You get in the car, you're doing writing a paper, you're doing some work, you're making
Sure.
scrambled eggs. It's in the background, and I do think the wonderful thing about this change to more of a visual medium is that it does create more connection with music. It does create more deeper engagement. It does create more fan connections. So that's just something kind of wanted to mention to the audience that I think is a
Yeah.
big change before we talk about sort of the state of the market today.
Yeah, I wonder if it's cyclical too, that maybe, from the MTV
Hmm.
era, everything was so visual. And maybe back, in the late 50s, early 60s, when movies, that discovery of some of the early rock and roll in the late 50s, it almost feels like it's cyclical. And I think you're right, with short form video, reels and shorts and TikTok and Canvas and all of that, it is. It's visual, but it's also shorter chunks than those other eras.
Right. And as you were speaking, I was even thinking as a kid of the 60s, you had American Bandstand, you had all of those other, I forget what the Saturday night live concert shows. Um,
Oh, Don Kirshner's rock
Rock concert. There
concert,
was the
or yeah,
one with Wolfman Jack. So yeah, there's
yeah.
always kind of been this video component or this visual component to music through the years. But yeah, I think today it's kind of you can have your 30-second or 1 minute snack, and then you could go to Netflix and have, spend an hour and a half, 2 hours watching. So
Oh yeah.
there's much more variety for us now.
Yeah. I mean, it's so easy to fall into that YouTube black hole where you just fall deeper and deeper. Let's talk about streaming a little bit because you talk a lot about it in your reports. Streaming has clearly won the format wars for now. Um, but are we seeing signs of a ceiling, Russ? I mean, subscriber growth numbers are starting to sort of plateau and mature in markets like the US. What are your thoughts on sort of streaming?
Well, in the US, you've now got about half the population who's paying for a music streaming subscription themselves. You've got, streaming itself is somewhere in the 90% range in terms of what percent of people experience streaming at least once. And that's streaming across the spectrum. It's the radio models dating back to Pandora. It's the video models like YouTube, and it's the Spotify and the Apples in between.
Yeah.
So we have been looking at the streaming audience since I think 2002, so
Oh, wow.
24 years.
Mm.
And looking at how many people are subscribing as well. This year, we estimated there were about 130 million subscribers, paid subs in the U.S. It's closer to about 150 million if you include Sirius and people who subscribe to Amazon and use their music service. So that's pretty full penetration. It grew about 12 million subs this past year. I think to answer your question, every year we kind of model how much more potential is left. And, for those who took Marketing 101, you may be familiar with the funnel, right? We start out with, how many people are there out there that we get into the funnel that as the funnel narrows, we could eventually get them to pay for something. That funnel is getting skinnier and skinnier, especially over the past few years. So we're getting closer to, at least in the US, and probably my guess is for other developed markets, we're getting closer and closer to the max. And the other thing to keep in mind is, a lot of folks are on family accounts. A lot of folks are sharing accounts. Maybe they shouldn't be, but they are. So we're getting closer to full utilization of paid streaming.
Yeah. What do you think about the debate surrounding, the payout from streaming? From a consumer research standpoint, is there an appetite for these, super fan things that we're reading about, higher price tiers for streaming? What do you think?
This is what I'm going to say, maybe controversial, but I don't think that there's any appetite at all. If you take a look at the average streamer, they're not out there banging the gong that says, "Hey, I'd like something that's bigger and better." There isn't really any pent-up demand for that, and that's why I think part of the whole super fan conversation, which we could talk about later, is a little bit
Sure.
illogical. But before I get tomatoes and arrows thrown at me, I think that that's asking the wrong question, right? I think the question is, are there features that can be baked into the services that would then demand a higher price from consumers, or at least from a subset of consumers? So for example, every year we look at about 15 to 20 different features. And we ask streamers what they're interested in them. And they're things like, ad-free podcasts or VIP experiences, or would you like news? Would you like documentaries and so on? And the interesting thing is that there is a high level of interest among paid streamers, in additional features. So I think the question is, it's kind of like a Steve Jobs thing. If you go out and you ask consumers the question of, "Hey, would you like a super premium tier?" They go, "I'm pretty happy with what I've got." But if you say to them, "Hey, I just want to let you know that, that iPod that we gave you that has 500 songs, now we've got one that holds 5,000 and it comes in 10 colors and it just costs a little bit more." That's how you might be able to trigger some consumer response. So I think if you take a look at it from is there pent-up demand for additional features that could potentially be monetized? That answer is yes.
Do you think people care about audio quality? And the reason I ask that is I love, Qobuz and I love, high quality audio, but sometimes I'll listen with earbuds in, like if I'm working out or something, I really don't care. There's other noise going on. And I've heard this debate for a while, and I'd love to get you to weigh in on it, because there are those that claim that if you have a, higher quality audio, that people will pay more money for that. I'm not so sure that's true. What say you, Mr. Crupnick?
Yeah, well, I'll take credit yet. Nobody has done more research on high res audio than we have. We've been doing it for over 10 years. And we've looked at some of those questions that you've asked. It's really interesting, Jay, and it's kind of it's one of those oxymorons. If you ask consumers the question about, would you like studio quality sound, because they don't know what some of these definitions we use are foreign to consumers, but thinking
Of
about,
course.
the same way the musician hears it in the studio, generally it rises to the top in terms of one of those features that you would like from a streaming service. But then when you look at how they're actually listening, right? They're listening in the car when they're running to go get some bread or drop their kids off, or running to work. They're listening on, smartphones on subways. They're listening on smart speakers, and on and on and on. And the devices that they're using are, most certainly low. They're actually lower fi than probably what you and I listened to in college.
Hmm.
So there's this kind of, yeah, on one hand, it sounds really good. On the other hand, if you take a look how music is consumed, it's kind of somewhat in conflict with the two. So, did I answer your question, or did I just
Yeah,
leave
you
it
did.
wide?
It's
Did I
it's
leave it even more wide open?
a little of both, but would something like, I don't know, Dolby Atmos, Sony 360, some of these immersive things, which Man, Dolby Atmos blows my mind. I mean, I love some of those mixes. Does the general population care?
Well, I think that's again, if you ask them, do they care? They'll say yes. If we've had them in rooms listening, and they can clearly identify the difference. But the issue is, do they have the equipment? Do they have the connections? Do they have the use cases that take advantage of that? Now, again, that could be there's always that 10% that are, maybe like you and I who go, oh my God, I've never heard that harp on that, way in the background, so on and so forth. But it takes unique equipment and it takes a unique listening. One of the interesting things about vinyl is you have to ask people like, where do you listen to vinyl? Well, obviously not in the car and, not on a subway, but it tends to be a solitary experience. I'm sitting there. I want to relax. I want to tune everything out. That's when I'll put a record on. That's when I'll hear those kinds of things from an
Yeah.
analog
Yeah.
experience. So it's I still don't know if I've answered your question, but I think there's a
No, I
lot more
love the
factors than just
conversation.
saying, hey, would you
Of
like
course.
studio level quality? Because the answer is always, yeah, of course I would.
Well, you point out something really important, and that is there's a difference between what people say they do and what they do. How are younger listeners using streaming differently than older listeners? Is this passive listening, like via algorithms, is it killing that deep fan relationship in your mind that used to drive music sales?
No, first of all, I would push back generally on the concept of passive listening. I'm not sure that there necessarily is such a thing, and maybe to some extent, the algorithms of today are the program directors, who programmed Top 40 when I was a kid. Let's just talk about the younger listener for a second. They're more likely to pay for a subscription. They're using more features when they go on their streaming services. They're spending more time on platform. Um, and when you ask them, how do you actually interact, they're actually more likely to be a lean in, that whole idea of I'm leaning in, I'm adding things to my playlist. I'm actually, it's kind of like,
You're engaged.
versus I'm just like listening back and listening. I hate the
Yeah.
word, but I'm listening more passively. They're much more likely to be lean in listeners. And the interesting thing about younger listeners is that, yeah, there may be algorithms that are driving what's behind their listening, but when you ask them about, hearing something, 95% of them say that, once they get a recommendation, if they hear something that they like, they'll add it to their playlist. They'll dig deeper into the catalog. They'll explore the genre if it's not mainstream genres. They'll socialize the music, and so on and so forth. And about 9 out of 10 say it reinforces their connections to artists. So, I don't. I think net algorithm rhythmic listening for younger people, probably for everybody, but especially for younger people, tends to be more of a net positive than a net negative. I mean, I was listening to Bob Lefsetz this morning, and he used the term grease. That music is like grease; it lubricates other things that we do, and I don't know that I don't know that that's really changed over the course of modern music. Um,
I like your take on that. Recently you've helped me to understand a lot more about vinyl consumption and listenership because we hear these things in music press, like half the people that, buy vinyl don't own a turntable. Luminate does a report and sort of breaks it out by millennials and Gen Z. And then you and I had a conversation and there's a little bit more complexity into the stats about people consuming vinyl. You want to talk about that a little bit?
in which context, Jay?
Well, vinyl's been on this revival, quote
Mhm.
unquote, for a couple of decades now. There are those that will say that it's more of a merch item. It's not for listening. It's for uh, bragging rights.
Yeah.
But talk a little bit about what you've learned doing your work about how is vinyl really being consumed now? Who's buying vinyl new and used, and are they listening to it? Are they putting it up on their wall to show that I'm a bigger Crowded House fan than Russ is because I got the signed thing behind me?
Yeah, I think the answer to that, and obviously it varies by generation. The older you are, the more likely you are to listen to it. But even younger, even if you just take a look at, that crude cut of Gen Z, um, there's a fairly high level of listenership. I think that, we tend to have this conversation as binary. Do you buy it to listen to it, or do you buy it to put it in your wall or collect? There's this kind of middle that says I do both of those things. So I may take, there's a large group of Taylor Swift buyers who are taking those out, and if they have a turntable. And one of the things I don't like about, you kind of know this about asking people if they own a turntable, is my daughter would say no, but she has access to mine. So is there one in the household? I may go down and I use dad's turntable and I listen to it and then I go put it up on the wall. So, but I think the industry tends to get who's buying vinyl all wrong. There's kind of two issues around vinyl. Gen Z is more likely than any other demographic cohort or age cohort to be buying vinyl, not by much. I mean, it's a pretty even horse race between Gen Z and millennials and Gen X. But again, sort of, I'll say I think that's the wrong question as well. I like to look at the rate at which people are buying. If you take a look at a Gen Z buyer, they're 50% more likely than average to buy just one album. If you take a look at Gen X, they're twice as likely to be buying six or more albums. So you may get the same population walking into Grimey's, some young, some old, but if you take a look at what happens at the cash register, it's really different. And my other comment about vinyl is I think vinyl is the most underserved market in the music industry. What do I mean by that? It's a 1 billion market, $1 billion market, new vinyl is anyway in the US. 40% of new vinyl buyers only buy one album. That's crazy to me. And maybe that's all that they buy in 2 years. You know, I came out of consumer packaged goods, which is where your whole objective is to get somebody to buy again and to buy more. And we're not doing that with vinyl. We're not doing it very well with vinyl.
Why do you think that is? Do you think it's price? What do you think it is?
Well, I think part of it is, the fact that the younger generation is going in and buying that one vinyl for the artists that they really like. And again, they may listen to it once, they may collect it, they may do something. But I think one of the things that we should be doing a better job of is turning younger consumers into heavier consumers of vinyl. So, for example, I was looking at who are Taylor Swift's influences. One of them is Joni Mitchell. Joni Mitchell, to me, put out one of the best albums in modern history, which is Shadows and Light, right from 1980. Why can't we get Taylor to be talking about that album and encouraging her, her army to go out and purchase that vinyl as well? So I just think that there's an opportunity. Vinyl could be 1.4 billion, 1.5 billion if we did a better job of getting vinyl buyers to purchase more than just one of them.
Yeah, I'd like to see used vinyl tracked. I'm sure we would learn a lot from that.
I'm putting an article on that out. By the time this broadcasts, you may have that article in hand. But yes, I have some statistics on used.
I'm looking forward to that because just anecdotally talking to people who own record stores about the behavior of people coming into their stores, it seems to me that there's a lot of used vinyl that's being bought that isn't being talked about. But we'll cover that when that comes out. I was reading that in one of your reports that like 80% of people who stream music are are consuming non-music audio like podcasts and things like that. And I know just from my own habits, listening to either audiobooks or podcasts as well as music. Talk a little bit about what you've learned about non-music audio listening.
Right. Well, it's certainly we saw this with podcasts first, where if you take a look at any of the major streaming services, you've got a large proportion of listeners who are now also they're listening to music, they're listening to podcasts. Audiobooks, not quite so much, but it's kind of, it's getting there a little bit more slowly. I think the interesting thing is it tends to be complementary to music listening. There's been a lot of discussion of do podcasts cannibalize music. In general, it tends to they tend to be complementary to one another, and I think that the big advantage is that they keep a listener on platform even more. I mean, that's if I'm sitting at one of the DSPs, my objective is to say if I have somebody who's listening 5 hours a week, I want them listening 7 hours a week, and I don't want them doing something else. The whole idea, getting back to the whole idea of the attention economy. So I think, net podcasts have been a positive. Leaving aside, and I'm not getting into the financial implications of
Yeah.
that. We'll leave that discussion for another day.
I love audiobooks, like if I'm on a long flight or something, because it's typically the author who's reading their own book. And sometimes you'll pick up on humor that you might not have got. But it's always really interesting to hear an author read their own work. I jotted this down, and I can't remember what report this came from, and I attributed it to you. Tell me if I'm off base here, but the line I wrote down was, music listening is becoming obsolete. Did you write that? And if you did, what did you mean by that?
If I did write that, it was in the context of what we were talking before about, kind of
Uh,
visual complementing the oral with an A kind of
so
experience.
maybe just pure music listening.
Right, right. Which, as
Yeah,
I said before, just I think that's terrific. I think it's terrific from an engagement standpoint, from a fan connection standpoint.
yeah,
And I do, one of the thing, one of the best things I read was how Warner Music is getting more involved in the production of documentaries and content that can go on the video streaming services. Yeah, I think that's really wonderful because,
yeah.
to me, we've got to stop thinking of ourselves as being in the music business and think of ourselves as being in the entertainment business and the attention business. That's
Yeah. Yeah. I thought Billy Joel did a great job. He did a documentary recently, and on the streaming services, it's like 150 tracks, but it's not 150 tracks of music. It's probably half that because it's Billy talking for 20 seconds about this old gray whistle test thing, and then they play it. And I just thought it was wonderful to just kind of go through all of that.
Yeah, and I think if you're a fan, this is where I don't know if we'll have enough time to get into this super fan thing, but I think if you're a fan of any artist, it doesn't necessarily have to be a Beatles where you've got the anthology. I mean, I could listen to 800 versions of pick Norwegian Wood, the original, the this, the that, the outtakes, with or without the strings. I think that there's there's a deeper there's a deeper vein of fanship than just the top 20%. Everybody has an artist that they connect to for some reason, at least one. And that kind of content is something that can be, if it's available, can certainly be mined more, and eventually monetized.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm with you. Those artists that I absolutely love, I want to hear the stems. I want to hear the outtakes and the B-sides and the live recordings and all of that stuff. This isn't super sexy, but I wanted to ask you about radio. I read this article the other day. They said that something like in the United States, the average car is like 12 years old. And, some of them still have a lot of CD players in them. A lot of them have radio. Talk about how people still listen to radio, don't they?
They do, but at least for music, radio's influence, again, if I go back to that, as I mentioned, I was looking at 10 years of trends. Um, the influence of radio in terms of how much we listen, especially in, obviously among the younger you get, it starts to, I think the share of radio listening among teens is something like maybe 3, 4, 5%. It's really low as compared to their parents or their grandparents. So and the influence when I've been doing music discovery studies for over 20 years, back to the days when radio was king, and then through Pandora and YouTube and so on. Radio has, keeps kind of dropping off. In fact, if I were thinking about music discovery, it's obviously streaming is at the top, but things like Netflix even have surpassed radio as being important for music discovery. In fact, the streaming video services are more important than TikTok for music
Yeah.
discovery.
Well, let's talk about music discovery because I find this really fascinating that a friend of mine at one of the majors, they did an analysis on all of the different shows, like late night TV, early morning TV, XM Sirius, all of that. And they looked at, 5 or 10 artists that they've had on those particular programs to see if there was any lift involved.
Mhm.
And what he was telling me was that there are very few of those vehicles that provide actual lift, which doesn't mean you shouldn't do them. It's another impression. It's good. There's a lot of reasons why those things are good. But he was saying that, things like CBS Sunday Morning or NPR, some of their Tiny Desk and some of those things really, can spike a release. And you mentioned Netflix, which can be a beast. Talk a little bit about how are people discovering music today versus, say, 10 years ago?
Yeah, I would say I'm going to take you even back further. I'm going to
Please.
take you back around 20 years ago. If you went back 20 years ago, it was, radio was at the top. YouTube was just kind of starting. A few years later, we started to see YouTube and Pandora start to have an influence. And it was. You have to look at the discovery, but you also have to look at the action post-discovery. Like just discovering a song doesn't necessarily mean anything unless there's an action. So the action 20 years ago was I'd go into a record store and I would buy it. If you take a look at what's happening now, there's just streaming is way at the top, whether you're talking about audio streaming or video streaming or whether you combine them into one. I mean, that horse is way out in front. But then you do have other things like Netflix. You have, word of mouth. We don't talk about, but you and I just chatting about, hey, have you heard about this artist?
Yeah.
That's still really important. That's one thing that hasn't changed. Is kind of our social network, how we institute it has changed an awful lot in 20 years, but socializing music is still very important. But things like radio have diminished in popularity, especially among younger consumers.
Yeah, when I was first getting into music, there were two areas where I discovered a lot of great music. One was in-store play, just walking to my neighborhood record store and they'd put something on. I'd go, what is that? Right. And then later I worked at Tower and I saw it in action. There were certain records we could put on and we knew we were going to sell 10 copies as soon as we put it on. And then the other one is what we lovingly refer to as bass swapping or like an opening band. I discovered Cheap Trick when I was young. They were opening for another band, and I absolutely fell in love with them.
I think one of the things, and I don't want to make my competitors smart, but for you, I will. I think
Okay.
one of the things that people misunderstand about music discovery is it comes in two forms. Obviously, in your Universal days, you were really primarily concerned with new music discovery. How do we break a new song? How do we break a new artist? From a consumer standpoint, It's a little bit flipped. Yeah, they want to hear new songs from new artists, but they want to hear, and that soundtrack of your life thing, something like the beautiful thing for me anyway about Netflix or about the streaming services is I'm hearing things that I haven't heard in decades. Or I'm hearing artists that, maybe I didn't get in the 70s, but now I'm hearing them in soundtracks, or now they're coming up in recommendations. So it's the idea of rediscovery is incredibly important, and
Yeah.
it's something that the streaming services do extraordinarily well.
Yeah.
It's like
I
listening
think
to,
that's
in a
spot
sense,
on.
like listening to classic rock radio.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's spot on. I was just watching this Rick Beato video where he took this compilation of songs from the 70s and he was going through them. And I had to go grab the playlist and I've been listening to it in my car. It's rediscovery. I think
Yeah.
you're spot
Yeah.
on.
Yeah.
Um,
And it's not
if
just, it's not just us older folks. I mean, you've got 20 somethings who are saying, they have rediscovery too. It's just a little newer and different than maybe, guys of our age. So across the spectrum, that concept of rediscovery is super important when you have the conversation about music discovery in general.
Yeah, 100%. I have a focus group of 4 kids in their 20s, so I know exactly what you're talking about. If you had to predict one area of the music business that looks completely different 5 years from now, get out your crystal ball, Russ. What do you think that might be?
Um, well, obviously AI is going to be a really big deal. I'm just not sure we know how. Is it just, I kind of have a suspicion that it's probably going to be more institutionalized than we suspect now and maybe are even comfortable with. It's going to be just more part of our daily listening. Um, I think when we take a look at, the comment that I made before, um, the whole idea of thinking about music as entertainment, thinking about share of attention instead of thinking about share of listening. I mean, I do a ton of share of listening work, but thinking about all of the entertainment options, all the way that you could spend your time. Because we came from a thing where we had transistor radios in cars. I mean, if you go back, it wasn't, even today, listening in the car is one of those most important ways that you listen. It's captive. There are more opportunities and more options for the consumer now than there have ever been. So, how do you capture all of those different touch points? I think that's something that, if I'm thinking about technology, if I'm thinking about promotion, if I'm thinking about A&R, how do you make music sort of a top choice in all of these other situations where the consumer is across all of their various screens?
Is there any question that you think people in the music industry that you work with that they should be asking more that they're not?
One of the things because there's been so much conversation about these super streamers, and I'm not totally bought into that whole idea. As I mentioned before, I think every single music fan has the potential to be a super fan. So, I spend a lot of time thinking about sort of the mass market, right? How can we do a better job of raising, that we use the term ARPU, raising the ARPU, the spend, the engagement of somebody who's kind of in the middle of the market and not just the super fans. Because as I said, it's really kind of it's unique about music. I don't think it's the same in movies or everybody has an artist or two that they're, crazy about or that triggers something, their first love, their prom song, whatever it is. How do we do a better job in that middle market, and not just focus exclusively on super fans? which by the way, I'm still waiting to see the revenue on that.
I was talking to Pete Gambarg last week about A&R, and I told him I would be a horrible A&R person because a lot of these artists that I fall deeply in love with, they're not necessarily commercially successful. So as we sort of wind down here, Phil, I just wrote down Phil because it's one of my favorite albums. Russ, as we sort of wind down here, are there any albums that have come across your desk and that you've just fallen in love with that you share with people when they ask you what you're listening to, or maybe something you've had that's lesser known than, sort of the Beatles and the Joni Mitchells of the world?
Yeah, I'll tell you. And this is it kind of encapsulates what we've been talking about. I was listening to I was watching something on one of the streaming services, and I heard a song from Richard Thompson. And the song wasn't familiar to me, and I went on to my favorite streaming service, and I saw that there were a couple of versions of it. So I've become a bit of a rich, and he performs locally most every year. So now I've seen him live a few times. So I would say Richard Thompson, because I wasn't into the kind of the British folk thing back at the time. I was more of a rock and roll guy. But I would say Richard Thompson has been the one for me that I've been, telling people you've got to see him. He's one of the world's greatest guitarists.
Yeah, fantastic. Russ, where can people learn more about the work that you're doing? I know in the newsletter last week we had 3 of your recent pieces, and you're talking about used vinyl thing coming. Where can people learn more about you and MusicWatch?
They can go to our website, which is simple. It's Music Watch Inc. Or they can reach out to me at russ@musicwatchinc.com. And we'll get back to you right away if you have questions or want to discuss, or something I said was controversial. Please reach out. I'm also on LinkedIn, and I'll respond as you know.
Yeah,
well, Jay.
I do.
I love having these discussions.
I know you do, and I appreciate that about you. Russ, keep up the great work, and I can't wait for our next conversation. Appreciate you.
Great. Talk soon. Thank you.
You've been listening to Your Morning Coffee, the weekly music news program for the new music business. Join Jay Gilbert and Mike Etchart next time for the digital music news you need to know.